All right. Well, good morning, River City. How are we feeling this morning? That's a great response. I really appreciate that. It's Palm Sunday. I'm so excited to be here. If you're a guest in the house, I'm Eddie, one of the pastors here, and we are just right now in the middle of a series we started a couple of weeks ago entitled The Way of Jesus. And if you weren't here last week, our lead pastor, Jonathan, began our series by talking about two incredibly important details about this latter part of the ministry of Jesus leading up to the week we like to call Passion Week, which started today on Palm Sunday. And what he got into last week, I thought was super significant. And what I mean by that is that I've been thinking about what he mentioned last week over and over and over again leading up to our time today. And one big thing that he said last week was this, that Jesus had the power over death, that he had the ability to raise his friend Lazarus from the dead. And if you're familiar with the story, he waited 4 days to do so. That Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters, had this brother who had just passed away. They thought that Jesus was going to do something miraculous on the front end, but Jesus decided to do something miraculous on the back end, and it really did change the trajectory of his ministry. It really did put basically a bullseye on him saying, hey, this man has to die, at least according to religious leaders. But for Martha and for Mary, there was something also significant that happened in that moment. For them, as they were grieving over the loss of their brother, they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt when he raised Lazarus from the dead that he had a heart for them. And what we learned last week that I think is even more significant, at least in part, at least for us personally, that Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead is that he has a heart for us. He has a heart for me and for you. He sees into your pain, he sees into your grief, he sees into your problems, and he says to you, I see you, I'm here for you, I love you. My heart is for you. And what we're going to look at this morning is more of the details leading up to what happened on Good Friday that we just sung about, what happened on that Easter Sunday that we will sing about next Sunday. And the way we're going to get into that, though, is we're going to talk about some details and how when I was growing up, learned details, stories, important information, specifically from my parents. And for you guys, when you guys hear information, when you guys take in details, whether it be at school, whether it be at the job, whether it be just in the random sphere of the world that you live in, whether it be online, the way you take in information, the way you hold on to the details, it really does matter. It makes an impact in your life. Well, when I was growing up, I had two ways in which I received information, my dad's way and my mom's way. My dad's way, and my dad was a storyteller, he would back up about 10,000 feet, and he would give me a whole bunch of information from the highest level. Then he would come down and tell me some details about a certain thing. It could be how to hit a baseball. It could be how to tie my shoe. It could be what happened to him on a Thursday. He would give me the 10,000 foot level, the 9,000 foot level, the 8,000 foot level, the 7,000 foot level, the 3,000, the 1,000, the 999, all the way down to the 1 inch level. He would tell me all these details. And when I got done listening to that 30-minute conversation, that was one way because he was just telling me something, I learned a lot. It was significant. It helped me. But that's not exactly how my mom would describe anything to me. My mom, on the other hand, instead of giving me every single bit of information she could possibly give about a certain subject, she would tell me how, to introduce me to something. My mom's here, by the way. She would introduce me to a certain topic. Maybe it is something as simple as tying your shoe. She would tell you the end result at the very end, and then she would sprinkle in a little bit of detail in the middle. But the things that really mattered most when my mom gave me information was what she said at the beginning and what she said at the end. My dad, he layered all these bits of information all the way through it, and those things were significant, but the things I really held on to, and this is just true, were the first things and the last things. Because those things, sometimes, especially in information transfer, really help you understand where you're ultimately wanting to get out of what somebody's communicating, and honestly, what they're wanting to get you to understand about some sort of communication. And as I thought about that, I thought about the details of other things in our life, especially when we were in school, for example. When you would see phrases like, first things first, you paid attention. You were ready to take a note. You were ready to say, oh, this is probably going to be good. And then when you see things like one last thing, you're immediately locked back in, right? You're like, oh, I dozed off in the middle of your introduction or explanation, I should say. All the middle of the details, I was all over the place. But when you said one last thing, I leaned in. And when it comes to the details, I think even of our lives, there are certain things that we need to be holding on to and we need to be more and more aware of and paying attention to because those things are significant. There's certain areas of our lives where the details of those particular parts of our life, they matter. They're something that we need to hold on to and invest in a lot. For example, you have a family, you have friends, you have jobs, you have your health. All those things are of the utmost importance to you, and the details of those parts of your life, they matter. We need to lean into them. We need to be paying attention to the first things and the last things and even some of the details in between. And I would even argue that when you think about those important areas of your life, those things require, they're not just suggested, but they require your undivided attention. They require your undivided attention. This thing that we need to be giving the things that matter most in our life, the things that we need to not be kind of fuzzy over or divided over, especially when it comes to important areas like your family, like your friends, your job, your health. Those things matter. The details going on in the life of your family, they matter. The details going on in the friends that you have, that you're doing life with on the day-to-day, that matters. The job that you have, the career, you need to be paying attention to those things undivided. And of course, your bodies, your minds, the health in which you are operating, the body that God gave you, we are called to actually pay attention, believe it or not, undivided over those things as well. But the most important thing though, I think, something that we really kind of hang out here on Sundays and talk about a lot, that needs to be undivided as far as your attention goes, is your faith. What you believe and why you believe it. It matters. It matters probably most of all, because where you are with your faith and who you believe and why you believe in our case, Jesus, it impacts all the other areas of your life, from your family to your friends, your job, your health. And when we look into our faith and we kind of peer back or pull back the curtain of where we are in our relationship with Jesus, it's important for us to approach that with an undivided attention. And I say that because we're standing here, well, y'all aren't, I am. I'm standing here, you're sitting there on a Palm Sunday, where there's some significant events that took place about 2,000 years ago, and the details of those events, they matter. And it's so much so that it began to shape the trajectory of the people at that time around Jesus. That he was going in a direction, he was pulling people with him, and he was giving people more and more of an understanding about who he ultimately was. Because what he wanted more than anything for them to have was not just their undivided attention. He wanted for them to have, when it came to him, an undivided heart. He wanted them to have this heart that was not divided by what was going on in the world around them. Not divided by their own personalities or their own preferences or their own things that are going on in the world. No, he wanted them to lean in and to understand that not only did he have the power over death, he also had a heart for them. And he wanted more than anything for them to have a heart undivided for him. And what we're going to look at this morning is what Jesus did. He said a few things, but in this particular moment, on this particular day in history, he did some things. And the crowd responded in such a way that provides us, hopefully, with a little bit of a check, a little bit of a test to where we are as it relates to Jesus and our heart for him. We're going to look at two gospels this morning, Matthew, and we're going to look at John. We're going to look at the details of this story and what happened some 2,000 years ago on what we call Palm Sunday, why it matters for you and for me at the heart level. So we're going to look in Matthew chapter 21 to start. I'm going to read the whole passage, not all at once, you're welcome, but we're going to explain some things and break down some things so that we can hopefully begin to make some connections. And then we're going to go over to John and look at a few things that he had to say as well. So in Matthew chapter 21, beginning in verse 1, here are the details of the triumphal entry of Jesus on what we call Palm Sunday. It says, when they, that is the disciples and everybody with Jesus, when they approached Jerusalem and came to Bethphage and the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two disciples telling them, go into the village ahead of you. At once you'll find a donkey tied there with her colt. Untie them and bring them to me. If anyone says anything to you, say the Lord needs them, and he will send them at once. This took place so that what might be spoken through the prophet might be fulfilled. Tell daughter Zion, see, your king is coming to you, gentle and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. The disciples went and did just as Jesus directed them. They brought the donkey and its colt, and then they laid their clothes on them, and he sat on them. A very large crowd spread their clothes on the road. Others were cutting branches from the trees and spreading them on the road. We've heard this story, many of us, right, before. We've actually maybe even seen this actually played out. Like when I was a kid, I went to a very large church in Memphis, and every year they had an Easter play. At the beginning of every Easter play, there was this: Jesus riding in on the stage on an actual colt of a donkey, and there were people in front dressed up in first century like garb, and they were holding palm branches and they were doing all the things, and it immediately gets your attention. You're like, oh, this is the story. This is Palm Sunday. But what's significant about what happened here is all the things that Matthew records and all the things that were actually also going on in the city at that time. As Jesus was coming in to the city, as he was riding on the back of that donkey's colt, according to historians, and this is some stuff that we learned a couple of years ago, as a matter of fact, there was something else happening on the other side of town by the governor at the time, Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was on the back of a horse around the same time Jesus was coming in on the other side of town on the back of a donkey's colt. He had troops on the front and the back of him. It was the beginning of Passover festival week, and he was letting everybody know in the city of Jerusalem that there is no other king, no other Lord, only Caesar. He was showing once and for all that Rome had defeated all the other gods of the area, all the other kings of the area, and that they were ultimately in charge. There was some pomp, there was some flair, there were people celebrating all of this, and it could have been farther from what was happening on the other side of town with Jesus on the back of this donkey's colt, coming in humbly, coming in with a little bit of spice. I mean, there were some people there that were excited, they were cutting down palm branches, they were doing all of these things, and yet you've got the kingdom of God coming in on one side, and at the time, literally the kingdom of the world coming in on the other side. And the significance can't be overstated. And what's also interesting about this moment is that when it comes to prophecy, like prophetic things that are spoken about things that are going to happen next or in the future, this fulfillment took place from a prophet named Zechariah. And Zechariah wrote what he wrote about 600 years prior to Jesus even coming to the earth, even being born. 600 years ago, there was this mentioning, and no other time in history had anybody ever done anything like this. And here Jesus is on the back of this donkey's colt, and the words that is used, see, your king is coming to you, gentle and mounted on the back of a donkey's colt. There's something special, something being declared right there on a Sunday morning or afternoon. We're not exactly sure what time of the day it was, but it was a moment where Jesus was saying to everyone, that prophecy was written 6 centuries before I was around. That was pointing to me. That was about me. If you were looking for anybody else that's going to be the guy that needs to be within this right here, I'm the one. It is me. Look no further. Jesus was making a statement. He was letting people know, hey, God keeps his promises. God is in the middle of what's going on here. God told you someone, a king in the future, would come on a donkey's colt, and here I am. And what's also wild is that Zechariah's name means God remembers. Of course he does. In this moment, right here. And here's Jesus on the back of this donkey's colt, declaring to the people here that I am your king. And what's so significant is the response that these people had to this moment. I say that because they responded loudly. Let's look at the next verse. Verse 9. Then the crowds who went ahead of him and those who followed shouted, Hosanna to the Son of David. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Hosanna in the highest heaven. The crowds didn't whisper it. The crowds didn't just lightly sing it. No, they shouted at the top of their lungs with a full chest, blessed he who comes in the name of the Lord. Something that King David had written about 1,000 years prior. They were attributing this one person who was supposed to come into the world and fix all of this for them. They didn't know how. They didn't know necessarily all the details around why. But they were saying with a loud voice that this one riding on the back of this donkey's colt is the one we have been waiting for. It's the one that we needed. It's the one that we desire. It's the one that we have to have. And they were saying right there in that moment that there is no other king, no other Lord, only Jesus, which is a significant thing to say when you're being oppressed by the Roman world at the time. It's a significant thing to say when you're under the Jewish ruling class, the Pharisees, and all the pressure they're putting on them religiously. It is a significant thing to say when you have a King Herod who is sitting on a throne at a moment just doing whatever he did at the time. They were saying that our king is Jesus. He had gotten their attention, and more importantly, he had gotten their hearts. And it ends this way, verse 10, at least Matthew's account. He said, when he entered Jerusalem, the whole city was in an uproar, saying, "Who is this?" The crowds were saying, "This is the prophet Jesus from Nazareth in Galilee." The city, where at the beginning of Passover week, everybody was coming back into town for this festival that had moved away from the city or had been, not a part of, and now coming in. And what Matthew is recording is that these people, as he entered the city was going bananas. They were going off. And these people are like, well, what's happening? Who is this guy? Riding on the back of a donkey's colt like he is. What's going on with the cut palm branches and all the people throwing their clothes on the muddy ground? What's happening right now? And they said, this is the prophet from Nazareth in Galilee. This is Jesus. They were right. But he's so much more than that. And he was so much more than that for them in that moment. And what's interesting too is that we have another account. There's 4 total of what happened on this day, but the next account that we're going to look at is from the Apostle John. And John gives a little more truncated or abridged version of the story. He doesn't go through all the details that Matthew went through. He didn't do like my dad had just told you every single bitty thing. John gave you what you needed to know, like my mom does. Tells you exactly what you need to know in the moment. But what's significant is he adds a detail to his story, to what happened on that day, and he was there, and why it should matter for us. So we'll be in John chapter 12 for a second. And the way he begins this is by reminding his audience that Jesus had raised Lazarus from the dead. Remember we talked about that last week? And the significance of that little moment where he had power over death. And there were Pharisees in the midst of that moment. There were Pharisees that were there, the religious ruling class that did not like Jesus and did everything they could to kill him honestly from the jump of his ministry. And right in this moment, right before Palm Sunday, they were plotting to kill Lazarus again. Why? I mean, Jesus had just raised him from the dead. He'd been alive a week. And now they were plotting to kill him again. Poor Lazarus. Wow. But the reason why, and John explains it, is because people were coming to believe in Jesus. These crowds that were on this side of town, not on the Roman side of town, but on this side of town, during this particular prophecy fulfillment, they were aligning their hearts. They were pledging allegiance to their King Jesus. And John wanted to make sure everybody understood why. And then after Jesus' anointment at Bethany, in the plot to kill Lazarus, he says this in verse 12. The next day, after the plot to kill Lazarus was put in play, when the large crowd that had come to the festival, the Passover festival that we talked about, when they heard that Jesus was coming to Jerusalem, they took palm branches and went out to meet him. They kept shouting, "Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, the King of Israel." Jesus found a young donkey and sat on it, just as it is written, "Do not be afraid, daughter Zion. Look, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt." A much shorter, detailed account, right? John just gives you what you need to know. There's some prophecy involved. Zechariah gets mentioned again. The psalm from King David gets mentioned again. But there's one significant thing that Matthew doesn't include in his account that John does. And I've been looking over this for a month now, and it stood out to me over that course. And you might not have caught it while we were kind of reading it just through and through just now. But the one piece of information that John drops in there was this phrase, the King of Israel. Uh-oh. Again, this is not something that was whispered by these crowds. This is not something that was just said in passing like this right here. This was something that was shouted for all people to hear. People that were for Jesus, people that were against Jesus, the people that were for Jesus did not care necessarily in that moment, on that day, about the people that were against him. They knew full well with a full heart that Jesus was the king of Israel. It wasn't Herod. It wasn't Caesar. It was Jesus. That is where they were putting themselves. That's where they wanted their hearts to be, undivided over who Jesus ultimately was. It's significant. It's scandalous. These people could have lost everything, and a lot of them, believe it or not, they did, for believing this very thing. They were willing to give it all up. These disciples, these followers of Jesus, for this particular claim, because Jesus on that day declared beyond a shadow of a doubt that he was the king coming into the world. He was the king that was coming into to fix what was broken. He was the king on the back of that donkey's colt who was there to let everybody know that he is there for them. And he is who he is. And then John wraps up his account in verse 16. His disciples didn't understand these things at first. However, when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things had been written about him and that they had done these things to him. Isn't it funny sometimes how you're in the middle of a circumstance or a situation and you think you know what's going on, but once you get through it, you look back and you're like, oh, that's why that happened. It could be something great in your life. It could be just something that's insignificant, really and totally. It could be something super tragic. But once we get through some things, once all the details kind of get aligned and you can kind of put them in order, a lot of times you can see the significance of why certain things happen to you. For these disciples, as they were spending time with Jesus in ministry, as they were going, day by day, like miracle, teaching, questions, confusion, they get through all of this. Jesus is crucified on that Friday, raised from the dead on that Sunday, ascends to the Father 40 days later, and they're looking back, and John's like, hey, I was here, man. I didn't get any of this. I didn't understand a thing. But I get it now. I get all of it now. And what was wild is that John, like Matthew and the other gospel writers, they wanted to make sure that anybody who was willing and ready to follow after this Jesus understood exactly who he was and what he did and the significance of all those little details, all those little bits of information that they were able to glean and pull from Jesus. They wanted to make sure that they understood the beginning of the things and the end of the things. They wanted to make sure that when we talked about the birth of Jesus, and we celebrate that at Christmas, and we talk about the last of his ministry, like we celebrate here at Easter, that all those details are just right there ready for you. Why? Because they understood the importance and the necessity of having an undivided heart around Jesus. And that the details of his life, especially the beginning and the end, and right here at the end where we're standing on a Palm Sunday and sitting on a Palm Sunday, we should be focused and locked in on the details surrounding what happened next, what happened on this day. We should be making some decisions at the heart level about what all this should mean and could mean for us. Because Jesus on this particular Sunday, which, like I said, we celebrate it. We've been celebrated for years. He said some things and he did some things. And the crowd responded in such a way that should be our response as well. Their allegiance was to Jesus. Their hearts were for Jesus. And it became more and more undivided. They were saying some things and they were doing some things. They were making some claims and shouting shouts of praise. They were not allowing the things of the world to impact more than what Jesus was here to do and who he ultimately was. Because for them, there is no other king, no other Lord, only Jesus. And there will never be another king, there will never be another Lord, there will only be Jesus. And we have to reconcile that in our hearts. We have to give our attention ultimately to that. And what a perfect day at the beginning of Passion Week for all of us to consider those things to the core of who we are. So as we wrap up our time together, I want to ask us 3 questions. Questions that I've asked myself over the course of the last couple of weeks. The first one is this. Does this statement, no other king, no other Lord, only Jesus, does this have your undivided attention? These people were convinced that Jesus was the one that Zechariah prophesied about 600 years before. They were convinced he was the one that was going to fix what was broken in the system of their life at the time. Is this where we are? Are we there? Are we convinced that Jesus is in the middle of your mess? That is willing to do much like he did the week before, raising Lazarus from the dead and feeling the hurt of Martha and Mary. Another statement, another question I should say is this. Does this story have your undivided attention? We've been spending about 25 minutes on this thing. I've been in this. We've been talking from two different accounts about Jesus riding in the back of a donkey's colt, letting everybody know that he is king and there is no other. Has this story settled in? Does it have your mind's attention, your heart's attention? Are you willing to say, hey, wow, there's something super significant about what happened some 2,000 years ago on a Sunday, prior to a Friday, prior to the next Sunday? And the last question is this. Does Jesus have your undivided attention? He deserves it. He deserved mine. There's nothing he could have done to make the world more aware of his love and his care and his mercy and his grace and his sovereignty and his power than every little thing that he did. Every detail of his ministry. Everything he said, everything he went through, all of it. And for me and for you, our response back to that should be an undivided heart. Well, how do we get there? Well, I think we need to do some inventory of where our heart is and how much of it we're giving away to Jesus and how much of it we've given away to the world. Because for Jesus, what he wants is for us to understand that the world's going to sell you a whole bunch of stuff that will not satisfy you. Going to give you all these things that you think you need, but it's damaging to your heart. And he knows full well what he came to do. He knows full well what he was capable of, and he accomplished it for me and for you. So that we could go to him, we could work out some of the details, we can die to some things in our life, we can say no to the ways of the world, so we can say more and more yes to the kingdom of God, who has a king, whose name is Jesus. So what I want us to do this week as we continue on to Good Friday is I want us to consider this phrase. No other king, no other Lord, only Jesus. I want us to say it. I want us to repeat it. I want us to think about it. I want us to believe it. And I want it to let it make an impact on our lives because it matters that much. Let's pray together. Father, I thank you for your word. I thank you for our time together to get into this story. That, Lord, when it comes to knowing you, the details of what Jesus experienced in his ministry, the impact that it can make on our hearts, Lord, I pray that we approach this with not only an undivided attention, but that we really work on giving Jesus an undivided heart. And it's a process, Lord, and you know this. But you've given us your Spirit. And he is there for us to convict us and to comfort us, to inspire us and turn our attention back to Jesus. Away from the things that distract, away from the things that pull us away. And God, I'm so thankful for dates on the calendar like this one, where we can look at things that were so significant, such a statement. He is the king. The crowd's got it. And I pray we get it too, more and more as we grow in our relationship with you. And Father, I pray for those in the house who do not know you, don't have a relationship with you, that maybe through this story and the details that were provided this morning, They understand the love that Jesus has for them. And they're willing to recognize that there is a distance between them and you, God. That sin is a problem, and they are covered up in it. But if they're willing to die to that, if they're willing to give that away, admit they have a need in you, Lord, that you'll rescue them and you'll save them, like you did so many other people in this room and a lot of other rooms around the world for the last few thousand years. So God, as we get into this Passion Week, as we think more and more about what your Son did for us, I pray that we remind ourselves often that there is no other King, no other Lord, only Jesus. It is his name I pray.